Loudspeaker broadcasts from South Korean borders into North Korea have been amped up as the regime resumes its floating of waste-carrying balloons into the southern part of the peninsula. On Issues and Insiders today, we touch upon the latest developments here, making headlines elsewhere as well. Hello and welcome. You're watching Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders for July 22nd. I'm Min Sunhee. We start the work week with a look at the latest headlines involving the two Koreas. For this, I have Andres Sanchez Braun, a correspondent for Spanish news agency EFE Spain. Andres, it's great to have you back.
Thank you always for having us here.
I also have Thomas Maresca, a correspondent for American news agency UPI. Thomas, it's good to have you here.
Thanks, great to be here.
Right, Thomas, you recently covered South Korea's resumption of loudspeaker broadcasts into North Korea following the latter's refloating of waste-carrying balloons into the southern part of the peninsula. Do share with us your coverage, please.
Right, so South Korea started the loudspeaker broadcasts again on Thursday night into Friday. And at first it was just a kind of a part-time thing, a few hours, a few locations. But over the weekend, they've announced that they've picked it up more full-time yesterday and again today. Now it's something like 16 hours a day at pretty much every location that they have loudspeakers along the DMZ area. And apparently it's as you mentioned, it's in response to North Korea continuing to float these trash-carrying balloons and. Apparently the content of the broadcast is kind of K-pop songs, music, and then news and some propaganda. And some of the things I've read that they've been broadcasting news-wise is, stories about the North Korean diplomat who defected from Cuba, Arirang, or saying that North Korean soldiers are being injured and killed by planting mines, and kind of trying to plant the seeds of discontent with the North Korean soldiers. I think just in general, it's another step towards what we've been seeing of the tensions in that whole border area really being on the rise, particularly since North Korea pulled out of that 2018 inter-Korean agreement in November, and then Seoul responded in last month by pulling out of it. So, the North has been floating the balloons, and they've been kind of responding to the South Korean defectors floating balloons carrying pamphlets and USB media into the North, which really, seems to kind of enrage the North. And so, we don't know what the effect of these broadcasts is going to be, but apparently they can reach, fairly well, like something like 25 kilometers inland. So, soldiers will hear it, maybe people living near that border area will hear it. And, it's just, it's another kind of almost this Cold War era. I mean, this has happened in the past in 2015 for a couple of years, and then maybe 10 years before that, so it's come and gone with the rising tensions. And apparently North Korea is preparing to respond. So it feels like we're back to this really kind of tense border area situation.
Right. And Andres, as Thomas just mentioned, North Korea, it's highly sensitive to these broadcasts from South Korea. How are pundits explaining the regime's response?
Well, I think it's important to understand why these broadcasts really annoy the regime and why, especially now. To add a little bit on what Thomas already mentioned, these broadcasts are conducted through, there's two kinds of speakers. There's a fixed one, which is the one that I think reaches like 24, 25 kilometers inland of North Korea, which is quite a lot. And then there's apparently there's some mobile ones that are going to be deployed now, or were deployed this weekend, I think, for the first time. These apparently have even longer range. But it's also important to understand that these broadcasts have changed over time, because back in the day, when these broadcasts were conducted, let's say during the Kim Il-sung era in North Korea, back in the 70s and the 80s, it was a bit of, you would say propaganda, come and live in the South, we're wealthier here, that kind of thing. What they do now is kind of different. Like, for example, they'll try to be, first of all, more informative than provocative. So, for example, you'll get even weather forecasts, apparently, to build credibility. North Koreans will listen to this and say, oh, well, actually, they did get this right. It did rain starting at 4 p.m. Then, of course, there's the news that Thomas was mentioning, and very damaging one, which is, mentioning that this diplomat defected to the south this week, and this is extremely humiliating for the regime, for the, to know that your people are knowing that high elite members of your establishment are actually defecting to the south, right? If people that are doing well within the system are running away, that's quite telling. So all in all, there's also, for example, information apparently being transmitted in these broadcasts of how, tips of how to defect, apparently. And even telling North Koreans what kind of support the South Korean government will give them if they decide to come to the South. So I think one of the reasons that the regime finds this very damaging right now is because of the dire economic situation. Since the pandemic, daily life in North Korea has become more and more difficult. And so, the regime has been trying to control this potential outflow of people. They've reinforced border security, etc., knowing that this could happen. And then there's an extra reason since January, since Kim Jong-un took this, let's say, a strategical shift in diplomacy and decided that South Korea was going to be, the country's number one enemy. He's deployed lots of soldiers to the border areas to, like, for example, rebuild guard posts, replant more mines, etc. So, as the South Korean military actually said last week, there's large numbers of North Korean soldiers right now in the border areas, working in very bad conditions. Let's say they were talking about 18-hour shifts. They were talking about how these troops sleep in very flimsy tents, work in extreme heat or downpours, etc. So that actually also sets a bad a bad scenario, because a lot of people could actually opt to defect when you're strained psychologically and physically. So of course the regime right now probably is not happy at all with the broadcasts. I'm curious because these latest balloons were containing scraps of paper instead of all other sorts of filth that we've seen this day. So maybe, I don't know, maybe they've been willing to tone it down a notch. We'll see in the next coming days.
In the meantime, against this backdrop, Thomas, how do the latest political developments in the U.S. look to affect perhaps policies on North Korea among regional allies, including South Korea and Japan?
Right. Well, it's only been a few hours really that we heard that Biden decided to step away and not choose to run for re-election. So we still don't know who will become the Democratic candidate. It seems that Vice President Kamala Harris is the front runner, and I think on that side of things, there's not much expectation that policy towards, pretty much foreign policy in general, maybe there's some room in something like Israel to kind of change maybe course a little bit, but I think as far as NATO or as far as this region, I don't think anyone is expecting like there would be a significant shift in any way. And, Harris has already been, has traveled quite a bit and has represented the administration in a lot of regions. He's been here in Japan and, to Europe as well. So I think, really the bigger question is going to be, does this help the Democrats, give them a better shot of winning the election in November? The alternative is if it's a Trump victory and administration, that I think brings with it, initially just a lot of uncertainty. Trump says we don't really know what the foreign policy playbook is going to look like. Trump says a lot of things. He doesn't always necessarily do them or hasn't always been able to maybe do what he's wanted to. But I think especially this time around, the second time around, we saw it at the convention. We saw it in the choice of his running mate, J.D. Vance. This is not the first time around, there were the so-called sort of adults in the room that could perhaps check some of his more just wild or unpredictable instincts. This time around, it's full-blooded. This is his party. This is this kind of MAGA, movement. And so, we know that there's a much stronger isolationist, sort of America first backdrop to foreign policy. And Trump has always had this very transactional way of talking about alliances or just the world in general. So, we've already seen, I think pretty much South Korea, Japan, NATO partners, you have to prepare for either eventuality. There's been some concern that Trump has in the past wanted to demand that South Korea pay a lot more of the cost sharing for the troops. He's even said, we should, maybe we would have to pull the troops out if they don't, pay, which I don't know if that's true. But, we saw actually in April already, South Korea and the US started negotiating for the next round of cost sharing. And, there's some sense like they want to get this at least locked in case, there is a Trump administration. And, I think, as far as the allies like South Korea and Japan, certainly the Biden administration was very, very pivotal in kind of helping facilitate Tokyo and Seoul getting closer together, and certainly, creating this stronger like trilateral security arrangement. So, we've already seen a little bit too of Seoul and Tokyo and perhaps trying to meet more directly, and then they had a couple of defense officials met last week one-on-one for the first time in some years. So I think, around the edges, everyone is trying to prepare, but there's not really a sense of what this could all look like. If Trump and that, that sort of wing of the Republicans has already signaled that they're much less interested in supporting Ukraine as full throat, with as much support as the current administration. If that strengthens Russia, that's already playing out in this region with Russia's relationship with North Korea. On the other hand, the Kim Jong-un factor comes back in. Trump has already brought Kim Jong-un up in some of his recent appearances, saying, I think Kim misses me. So does Trump try and do something new with restarting North Korean diplomacy? But I think the underlying idea is that it's just completely creates this world of uncertainty, chaos, and allies, and pretty much everyone has to try and figure out, how can we move forward, kind of, if it's not Trump-proofing some of this, maybe future-proofing some of it, some of the aid to Ukraine and perhaps some of the military relationship with South Korea and Japan.
Right. Against this climate of uncertainty, as Thomas mentioned, and he also spoke, of course, about the defense authorities, officials from South Korea and Japan meeting. A report by CNN covered that meeting and claimed that authorities here in South Korea and Japan, I'm going to borrow Thomas's words, were in fact seeking to lock in coordinated responses towards North Korea, Russia and China prior to any major political change in the US. Do you suppose this is the expected direction that the two countries are looking to take?
I would say it's definitely the expected direction, and yes, at a certain level, I think everybody's trying to, and it's not only public administrations, it's also companies trying to secure certain positions in case Trump does become the president of the United States once again. But I think most importantly, this meeting of the chiefs of staff between Japan and South Korea was the first time such meeting happened in 6 years, which is quite telling of how ties with Seoul and Tokyo have warmed up, especially since Yoon Suk-yeol became the president, and with the Biden administration's pivotal role, as you were saying, facilitating that. And I think we're going to see pretty much that as long as Yoon is the president, and that's going to be until the 2027 election. So there's still a few years to go. And also, as I was mentioning the other day, the fact that we saw, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin meet in June and sign this new strategic alliance agreement that states that, both countries will assist each other in case of military attack, whatever that means. But as I pointed out, Putin tried to frame it as a bit of a warning, like, this is what's happening when, Seoul, Tokyo, Washington get too close militarily. Well, I think the effect it has is actually the opposite. I think Seoul and Tokyo have even better reasons now to solidify this alliance and this military cooperation framework. And of course, is it the right direction in terms of de-escalating? Probably not. But this is basically what we're seeing in the region and pretty much the rest of the world. Like these blocs consolidating.
Right. Meanwhile, Andres, I'd like to go back to a story that both you and Thomas mentioned earlier, the defection of a North Korean diplomat to South Korea from Cuba. Very briefly speaking, what do we know about him thus far and his decision to defect?
Yes, the Chosun-ilbo newspaper published last week this surprise exclusive interview with Mr. Lee Il-gyu, who was the political counselor of the North Korean embassy in Cuba. So his defection came as a surprise. He defected apparently in November of last year. Well, it was sensitive also because South Korea and Cuba just announced that they this year that they established diplomatic ties. But on top of that, I think it's important because it's probably the defection of a highest ranking official since 2019. There was the chiefs of mission of the embassies in Kuwait and Italy in 2019, and then of course in 2016 there was Tae Yong-ho, who was the second in command of the North Korean embassy in the UK. So of course this is always very damaging for the regime, as we were talking, we were saying before. This person, Mr. Ri, in particular, this was his second stint in Cuba. He actually played an important role during his first deployment in Cuba, freeing this, you might remember this story about this boat that was caught in Panama, detained with carrying weaponry from Cuba to North Korea. Mr. Ri actually played a big role securing the boat back and the crew, and so when he went back to Pyongyang, he actually got a medal from Kim Jong-un himself. So, it's a very meaningful defection, I got to say. And Mr. Ri also mentioned, he said how he was growing very tired of the sense of corruption within the regime. He tried to get some medical treatment for an apparent injury he suffered in his neck. He wanted to go to Mexico. Pyongyang said no, so that's when he decided, that's that. But he also mentioned the fact that he had been watching Hallyu content in Cuba. Because believe it or not, even though Cuba's a communist country and not the most open country in the world, but you'd be surprised how popular South Korean cultural contents are in Cuba. I know this from KBS staff for the radio, the KBS World Radio broadcasts in Spanish, that their Cuban audience is actually one of the most faithful. They get mail even in paper from fans in Cuba telling them how much they like their content and the KBS's role in broadcasting South Korean cultural content. So Mr. Ri apparently just walked to these black markets, told these people like, hey, I want this show or this movie. And so once again, proof of how South Korean contents can actually apparently damage the regime's plans of keeping at least their elite on their side. And yes, but we've seen how the regime actually passed a couple bills, one in 2020 against reactionary ideology and culture, I believe, and then the one in 2023 trying to protect the cultural Pyongyang language, it's called. So basically trying to keep people from talking like using South Korean slang that they see in these movies or shows, or once again, very symbolical.
Right,
affection.
indeed. And staying with Ri Il-gyu, Thomas, very briefly speaking, he also touched upon the potential impact of South Korea's establishment of diplomatic ties with Cuba on North Korea. Do tell us briefly about that.
Right, so as Andres mentioned, South Korea reestablished diplomatic ties just in February. And in his interview, Ri said that it came as, he said, a great shock and betrayal to Kim Jong-un. And, you know, partly I think Cuba was like the last of these Cold War socialist bloc allies of North Korea. Now I think there's only one country left that has relations with the North and not the South, which is Syria. So, you know, and in February as well, they recalled the ambassador, the North Korean ambassador from Cuba. So, you know, Ri was speculating that he's going to be the one to kind of take the fall. And I have to also wonder, Ri mentioned he thought he could see South Korea, the wheels turning, you know, that they were going to reestablish relations. So he may have also decided to leave maybe before that happened. But, you know, just generally, I think it is also another sign of the kind of isolation that North Korea has on the world stage. I mean, they still have the embassy there, but they closed a lot of embassies last year. So, you know, their world seems like it's getting smaller and smaller and is more and more, they're more and more reliant on this, you know, relationship with Russia in particular. I mean, still some of China. So it's a bit of a sign of that as well. But yeah, I think, you know, I wouldn't want to be the diplomat who got recalled from Cuba.
Right, for sure, of course not. Ri Il-gyu also talks about the importance of Pyongyang opening up transparently to the rest of the world, given the latest developments. All right, Thomas, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Andres, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.